how Jerry Lewis was responsible for one of the worst flops in TV history.
But before we start, please take a moment to give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll never miss these great stories.
Between The Nutty Professor, his long-running telethons, and partnership with Dean Martin, there is no doubt that Jerry Lewis cemented himself as a comedy legend. That legacy, however, relies on audiences ignoring more than a few flops. Slapstick fans have largely forgotten that Lewis was behind one of the most expensive failures in TV history. Of course, Jerry remembered it all too well for the rest of his life. The project was born out of a broken friendship. By the mid-1950s, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis had been the world's biggest comedy duo for about a decade. But hit movies and frequent variety show appearances couldn't stop the inevitable. Jealousy and typecasting drove the pair apart, to the point where they didn't speak to each other for years. Lewis, in particular, wanted to prove that he could shine on his own. And shine he did. A string of films with Jerry as the star, writer, and director proved he was a veritable A-lister. But following the success of 1963's The Nutty Professor, the funny man received an offer that lured him back to the small screen. Late-night talk shows were reaching a crossroads, as the young Johnny Carson recently took over for Jack Paar on The Tonight Show. Some network executives thought that Carson could be easily outclassed by a more established talent. In fact, Jerry Lewis guest hosted The Tonight Show for 2 weeks in between the hosting transition and earned rave reviews. The prospect of him being behind a talk show desk every night seemed like a sure thing to any network executive. Elton Rule, Wright, the newly dubbed head of ABC, was willing to put everything on the line to sign Lewis. With essentially a blank check, he reached out to the comedian and struck a deal. ABC agreed to pay Jerry an astounding $40 million for a 5-year contract. This sum, worth over $320 million today, made him the highest compensated star on television. Meanwhile, Lewis began to expound on how he was going to do this show his way. For starters, Lewis had the network buy Los Angeles' historic El Capitan Theater. It once housed the Colgate Comedy Hour and Richard Nixon's famed Checker speech, but Jerry decided to give it a $400,000 renovation and rename it after himself. With the king in his castle, The Jerry Lewis Show was set to begin production in the Jerry Lewis Theater. As he kicked back in his dressing room, painted gold like the entire interior, the host ruminated on how this would be different than any other talk show. To his credit, Lewis wanted to push boundaries beyond the staid conventions of variety shows. He envisioned a more improvisational approach, where he and his famous pals would shoot the breeze and mix in all kinds of performances over the course of 2 whole hours. Lewis bragged that he'd have nothing short of complete control, adding, "I'll be doing something I've never done before," he said. "It'll be what people want. I'm going to play it loose. I'll be what I'm with. I suppose I'll have guests." The Jerry Lewis Show announced its premiere date for September 21, 1963. While viewers were salivating over this supposed turning point of TV history, the program got off to an inauspicious start. Despite ABC sinking millions into production expenses, Lewis found that their technical setup was less than dependable. He grimaced as his audio failed during his opening monologue, though that wasn't the only problem. Critics and audience alike agreed that the show simply wasn't funny. Lame jokes were met with silence, and slow pacing had viewers changing the channel. The Jerry Lewis Show failed to find its footing after a few episodes, and the staff looked to their big star to turn the ship around. Facing a rough start, Lewis fell into a pit of misery. Writer Dick Cavett, a future talk show host himself, recalled, "You could watch Jerry go down, 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 the showbiz equivalent of the Hindenburg." ABC executives couldn't help but sweat. One of their biggest projects ever was going down the toilet, and Rule and his colleagues needed to save their own skins. They already paid out $8 million for Lewis' first season, but saw they could regain the rest if production stopped there. The vast sum made it an easy decision. ABC canned The Jerry Lewis Show in November, and even the remaining taped episodes didn't air on time. Following the assassination of John F. Kennedy that month, networks suspended all their primetime programming. Even so, Lewis vowed to return. Jerry probably should have kept his mouth shut. While he brought back The Jerry Lewis Show to NBC in 1967, this version fizzled out as nearly quickly as the original. He later admitted, "Television is not for me," but remained defensive about the expensive flop for the rest of his career. He felt like he was unfairly raked through the coals, especially because he was trying to break new ground. Lewis shot back, "I don't make little bombs. I make gargantuan bombs, but if I can quote Mr. Roosevelt, it's not the critic who counts, but the guy in the arena, the guy who sweats." Jerry's fans knew that he was a performer unafraid to take risks. During a 1965 performance in Las Vegas, Lewis took a severe tumble off a piano while doing his routine. It was so bad he almost suffered permanent paralyzation. Luckily, he made a full recovery. Even though Lewis recovered from the piano fall, the recovery led to a brutal addiction to painkillers. For 13 years he lived in the dark depths of opioid addiction but finally kicked it in 1978. As much as Lewis did for comedy, he also did a lot for filmmaking. He invented a video assist feature that allowed for footage review immediately after filming. This saved so much money and time on editing. As much as Lewis loved comedy, he also had one hobby he was obsessed with. He would cut and edit other people's home movies for his own personal use. Then, if they wanted to watch, they saw his edited version. From an early age, Lewis took an interest in the theater. In fact, his father was a vaudeville entertainer who performed constantly, and his mother played the piano for a local radio station. At the ripe young age of 5, Lewis began performing on stage in New York's Catskill Mountains with his parents. This was the same place where legends like Jerry Stiller and Lenny Bruce got their start. Lewis' parents had such hectic schedules as entertainers they frequently left their son home alone while they performed gigs. This lonely time was likely where Lewis developed his need for attention, which turned into his desire to perform for audiences. Like a lot of famous funny faces, Lewis spent a chunk of time as a child pulling pranks on friends. Even as a teenager, he would break into homes and steal things like pies out of refrigerators. The name Jerry Lewis was just a stage name he went by. However, there's a lot of mystery surrounding his actual name. His autobiography revealed his name was Joseph Levitch, but other documents claim it's Jerome Levitch. Interesting. Even though so many people loved Lewis throughout his career, his son Gary told a much different story. He referred to his father as a mean and evil person. As beloved an entertainer as Lewis was, his romantic life was tarnished by serial infidelity. He frequently cheated on his wives, and he would even openly brag about the affairs on stage without shame. In 2009, Inside Edition explored a rumor Lewis had an illegitimate child with a model named Lynn Dixon. After discovering he likely was the father, Lewis ordered her to never contact him. Everyone has their own quirks, and Lewis definitely had some odd ones. One thing he required his personal aides to do was arrange the bills in his wallet based on serial numbers. One thing Lewis treated himself to once he hit mega stardom was new socks. The guy literally wore a new pair of socks every single day because he loved the way the new material felt on his feet. At just 15 years old, Lewis developed an act now considered one of his most famous. It was called Record Act, and it basically involved him lip-syncing a song and totally over-exaggerating the dance moves. For 44 years in a row, Lewis hosted his ultra-popular Labor Day telethon. The telethon raised money for the Muscular Dystrophy Association, which he was a national chairman for. So far, the telethons raised over $2 billion. Even though Lewis graced plenty of stages, he always wanted to appear on Broadway. He finally got his chance in 1995 to fill in for a role in Damn Yankees. Phew, at last. The Eddie Murphy film The Nutty Professor was actually a remake of the famous Lewis movie of the same name. Plus, Lewis himself was actually one of the executive producers. Everyone knew Lewis as a world-renowned funny man, but he flipped the script for a Martin Scorsese film called King of Comedy in 1983. Critics and audiences were floored by the comedian's serious side. A lot of comedians are one half of a famous duo, and Lewis was no different. His partner in crime was Dean Martin. The two men were just getting their start when they first met and leapt into stardom together. Dean Martin was known as the King of Cool, and it's easy to see why. His crooning, relaxed nature made him a popular performer on the stage and on the screen. It was his effortlessly cool personality that catapulted him to fame.